And what I'm going to talk to you about today are issues around climate change and policy, and we'll try to link it all back. A lot of what I'll focus on today are energy issues because, as you'll see, I think energy issues are the big thing we have to deal with when it comes to dealing with the climate change challenge. But I'm actually going to start us off by just reintroducing this concept of off-grid communities and remote communities in Canada. This is not a complete map. There are actually, according to Natural Resources Canada, 292 off-grid communities across the country, and you can sort of see the geographic range that's represented there. 170 of those are Aboriginal, so we're talking about First Nations on reserve or communities dominated by First Nations. Mostly in the Northern Territories, although BC actually has 86 off-grid communities, largely out on the islands. It's not really represented well there because most of the islands aren't on that map, and in that kind of upper northwestern quadrant of the province. Quebec has 44, Ontario has 38, Newfoundland and Labrador have 28, and then the numbers sort of drop down from there. And there's about 200,000 people across those communities, which is only about 0.5% of Canada's population. So it's a big, diffuse problem. Off-grid communities are a diffuse problem. They're not a problem that gets a lot of political traction, except in election years like this year. They do have much better representation in a lot of cases in the House of Commons than you or I do. If you live in Nunavut, you're one of 30,000 or so that are represented by a member of Parliament. If you live in Toronto, you're one of 180,000 or 200,000 that are represented by a member of Parliament. So politically, the clout is actually there. They just haven't really figured out how to use it, I think. I'm going to throw some statistics at you. The world in 2012 consumed about 560 exajoules of energy. 560 exajoules, that's up, coming up at about 2.5% a year. And that's a short-term trend since 2010. But the short-term trend is probably the important one because we're seeing an accelerating trend in energy use globally, largely driven by the BRIC countries, you know, Brazil, less Russia, India, and China. This is all primary energy, so electricity and gasoline and things like that are not included in a primary energy supply graph. You can see that the biggest proportions up here are oil, coal, and natural gas. Coal is up 1% since 2010, largely driven by China. Oil is down 2%, and we can talk a little bit about why that is. And nuclear is down by about 1%. And renewables, sitting at about 13%, that's biomass, hydro, and other renewables, are at about or rising by about 1% or 0.5% per year since 2010. Not as fast or about as fast as coal is going up. Anybody want to take a guess as to why oil is dropping? It runs against all the economists' theories, right? You know, every economist on Earth up until 2012 or so thought that oil would just keep going up and up in use. So why isn't it? Nobody has a guess? You got a guess?
Was it, at the time, was it prices?
Prices, something to do with it. But there's another shift going on.
Is it the actual consumption of oil has gone down, or the percentage of oil consumption compared to everything else has gone down?
No, oil has actually gone down, physically gone down. And well, it's partly politics, but it's partly technological change. Cars are getting more efficient, although As of today, they'll be getting less efficient because VW will have to roll back all of the diesel adjustments that they did. And we're starting to see real penetration of electric vehicles. It's still measured as in terms of a % or so of the fleet, but the rate of uptake is huge. And then the biggest economies in the world are driving less. China and US are driving less. And this is a huge, huge problem for companies like GM that bet that China would just grow and never stop growing in terms of car consumption and car use. China will grow, and they'll grow fast, but it may be that they will hopscotch past the big internal combustion engine use, and they will go straight to electric vehicle use. Nobody is really sure. So that's what's happening globally. This is what's happening in Canada. We sit at about 11 exajoules, 10.7 exajoules in 2012. We're probably closer to 11 by now. We're going up at almost 1% a year. We're going up faster than a lot of the OECD countries. Certainly faster than the US, which is actually going down in terms of energy consumption. We only consume 2% of the world's energy. Our oil consumption has gone down 2% since 2010. Same reasons that we just talked about. Coal has gone down by 2%. Natural gas has gone up by 2%. Renewables sit steady at about 19%. At 19% renewables, Canada is the greenest OECD country. It's the greenest of the G20. We have a lot of challenges in front of us in convincing politicians that we need to be greener, when we already do much better than most of our peers. There are very few countries around the world that are this green. We're much greener than the global average. We're blessed, basically, with hydroelectric power to an extent that really no other major country is. So that's what we're looking at. This is our challenge, is that we're a really green country. We're still dominated by the big three, but coal use is now down to 7%. And I would not be at all surprised if Premier Notley in Alberta basically writes coal out of the equation, because that is the low-hanging fruit for her. And if she wants to clean up her province, and she says she does, that is what she will do. You take that out, you take a couple of plants out in Saskatchewan, and we're done. Our coal use is down to about 1%, and we can't really get away from that because that's all going into cement production and other kind of heavy industry, which is a little slice. And we'll see what happens to oil use in Canada. So you can work this out. Canada uses about 350 gigajoules of energy per person per year. It's not equitably spread out. Presumably babies use less. Presumably people in the north use more. Presumably, right? If you're traveling more by aircraft, so a business person might use more energy than your average Canadian. If you are really passionate about riding a bike, you might be using less energy than an average Canadian, but roughly 350 gigajoules. It's a lot. 350 is a lot in a world where, on average, people are using closer to 35. So we're using an awful lot of power. If you put it all together, we need about 62 petajoules to drive all these off-grid communities, all 292, which would be about 210,000 gigajoules. I think that's actually 210 terajoules. I used to know all the joule number modifiers, but it's something on that order. It's actually just a little tiny drop in the bucket compared to what our total energy use is, right? Again, close to less than 0.5% of our total energy use. Canada has some big climate goals. Right now, our goal, and this is probably going to change in November, is to reduce our emissions by 17% from our 2005 levels by 2020. we'll talk about whether that's actually reasonable or possible. We want to get 90% of Canada's electricity provided by non-emitting sources by 2020. That can include nuclear. It can include clean coal. We can talk about whether clean coal actually counts or not, but to the Conservative government it does. We have a policy to promote new pipelines, which has utterly failed. We'll talk about that a little bit. We have some new regulations on automotive emissions that basically follow the fleet emission standards from the US. And we keep talking about a new climate policy, but we don't have one. I could give you a little spiel on what each of the leaders is talking about in the run-up to the election. The real distance is between Prime Minister Harper and then Trudeau and Mulcair. Trudeau and Mulcair each want to do kind of their own version of the same approach, which is to let the provinces tell them what to do, and then they'll kind of put something together, a framework that'll tie it all in place. But we desperately need a climate policy, because if you go back to 1990, which is when the whole discussion around Kyoto or the whole protocol from Kyoto was supposed to kick into effect. You know, Kyoto actually happened in the mid to late 1990s, but the protocol reached back in time and said, okay, we're going to start to aim for targets below 1990 levels. In 1990, our emissions in Canada were about 600 megatons across our entire economy. Right now, we're sitting at about 699, 702, 705 megatons. So we've gone up by 100 odd megatons over the course of roughly 25 years. There has been one period where emissions fell rather dramatically, which was when we had the first big recession in 2009, 2010. You know, things started to fall off. They've never really recovered, but they're starting to go back up. You can see that since 1990, we've had an awful lot of plans. All those dotted lines are different plans, and we have never managed to really follow any of them, except for the last goal, the current goal, that 2017 or 17% by 2020 goal, where the recession actually pushed emissions close to where they were supposed to be. So Prime Minister Harper's goal, if you want to unpack it, is to keep the economy in recession until 2020. That's the only way that he's going to achieve the type of emission reductions that he's talking about, is to basically take a lot of industry offline. We now have another goal, which is that to go to zero carbon emissions by the year 2100. All of the leaders of the G7 came out after the last G7 meeting and said, yes, we're going to work towards basically a carbon-free, emission-free economy by 2100. That actually gives us some breathing room, because the reductions on a per-year basis are less than the reductions that would be required to get us to our current goal by 2020. To take us from 700 to zero spread over 85 years requires less of an emission reduction per year. So it was actually, I think, the Prime Minister's way of sneakily pushing his target up, not down. Which is kind of silly when you think about it. Canada's emissions break down like this. So 699 megatons, that was in 2012. Like I say, we've probably gone up a little bit since then. You can break it into all of these areas. So fossil fuel production, light and heavy duty road transport, electricity production, big one, stationary combustion. Stationary combustion is everything from your home furnace, which is typically natural gas. If you're off the gas grid, you're propane, or you're on something like that. Other transport emissions, rail, marine, aviation. Aviation is a small slice, but it's getting an awful lot of attention these days. Fugitive emissions. Fugitive emissions are things like gas leaks and gas flares, along a pipeline, oil leaks and oil spills, things like that, that we're not really capturing, that are very difficult to kind of track. Other industrial processes, so we're now talking about some of the very large emitters that are out there, like cement production, like chemical production, that in addition to burning fuel to make energy, they're conducting chemical processes that are emitting things. So when you make cement, you're breaking down limestone, like I said before, and that's releasing CO2. Agriculture, it's a relatively large slice, and then waste. Waste management and venting and flaring off of landfills. That's where our emissions come from, 700 megatons worth. And if you just look at this thing and you say, okay, well, how am I going to address emissions? If I was going to put together a policy, you might be inclined to just rank it based on the size of the emissions, right? And so that's how these things rank out. Number one is stationary generation. It's the biggest problem that we have. You'll notice that nobody has talked about stationary generation issues. Nobody. It's a non-issue in all policy right now. Electricity production, that's what everybody likes to talk about. Decarbonizing electricity. Light duty transport, we've spent a lot of time talking about that. I mentioned it a little bit earlier that we are seeing this kind of shift away from the oil-based gasoline or diesel engines towards electricity. We also have biofuels and other things coming in to try to decarbonize that piece. Fossil fuel production and fugitive emissions and other transport all basically tie. And then we have heavy-duty transport, other industrial emissions, agriculture, and waste. That's how they would stack out. Now, that's one way to look at it, but I think that it's also important to look at how our emissions are changing. And this is how they've been changing over the last, well, this is a 22-year cycle. So over 22 years, heavy-duty road transport rose by 54%. The emissions rose by 54%. This is the Walmart effect. This is the fact that we have gone from delivery of goods to centralized warehouses, mostly by rail, and then distributed through relatively small vehicles to lots and lots of trucks on the 401 and the Trans-Canada, moving goods, just-in-time delivery, you know, all of that side of things. Fugitive sources have gone up by 44%. And here's the thing about fugitive sources, they're really hard to measure. So there are some people that say that fugitive emissions might be 10 times or 5 times what we're actually tracking. In which case, fugitive emissions is by far and away the worst. Yep?
Did you not do a quick calculation on the Volkswagen in Canada to see how much more emissions those cars are producing?
So people have done that back of the envelope calculation. Bloomberg did something yesterday, I think. Across the 11 million cars that are affected, they said that it's the equivalent essentially of adding another coal-fired generating station that's spewing out emissions all year long, every year. So maybe not that much when you think, well, there's lots of coal-fired generators out there. But there's a lot of people who bought those cars thinking that they were green. And now they've discovered that they're not. And I think that's caused a lot of problems. Wouldn't really be a fugitive emission, though. That would fall under your light-duty transport, which is the next one, which sits at about 27% growth. Fossil fuel production has grown by about 25%. Other transport has gone up by about 20%. Then we get into waste, which has grown by 16%. Electricity production grew by 7%. Industrial processes dropped by 18%. This had a lot to do with the fact that a lot of big facilities were taken offline since 1990. Big steelmaking facilities in Hamilton have stopped being big steelmaking facilities. You take those off and it goes.
Canada?
This is just Canada.
Okay, thank you.
This is just Canada, yeah. And then other stationary combustion sources have gone down by a whopping 37%. So remember, stationary combustion was the biggest thing, the biggest slice, but it's dropped rapidly, largely because of old policies, so policies that we had in place in the 1980s and the 1990s. You know, things like furnace replacement. It used to be that if you replaced your furnace, you actually could get the federal government and the provincial government each to kick in basically a tax break or a bursary, you know, a return. So when I did my furnace, it was the last year of that program, and it cost about half the cost of the furnace. You know, we were able to get that much money back. And most of that's gone now because they figure that most people have upgraded. But I'd argue that that's something we need to deal with. The red line is our population growth. So Canada grew in population by 25% between 1990 and today. Fastest population growth across the OECD, I believe. We are, on a percentage basis, you know, rapidly expanding. This is why Toronto, Vancouver, Calgary, other cities have moved up so quickly and gotten so expensive, is that we are growing much, much faster than most of our peers. Only a few things are growing faster than our population growth. And so when you think of it on that basis, heavy-duty transport, the fugitive sources, and a little bit of light-duty road transport is growing faster than population growth, which means that our intensity is increasing. Everything else, our intensity is decreasing. So suddenly, you can re-rank these puzzles or these problems, and you can see that stationary generation ranks by growth at number 7. Electricity production tied at number 7. Agriculture is number 9. Waste production is number 6. Number 1, heavy-duty transport. Number 2, fugitive emissions, and so on. You can basically come up with a combined ranking for all of this, which says that we need to deal with our light-duty transport emissions. That actually is pretty good. It ties in with what policymakers have been focusing on. We need to focus on our fossil fuel production. Not at all a shock. You know, everybody in the world has been calling Canada out on our fossil fuel production. And this basically supports the fact that we got to get on top of it. Stationary generation still remains important. Electricity production and heavy-duty transport. Other transport come in. Heavy-duty transport comes in at number 2 or tied at number 2 as well. And that's an important piece because heavy-duty transport, the big trucks, is not something we're paying much attention to in Canada. We don't really have a strategy to drop those emissions. We have a 2% biodiesel target for our diesel mix and no ideas of growing that out. Heavy-duty transport becomes important for us in the big cities, but also for the remote communities because a lot of the stuff that we're moving to remote communities comes on the continental piece through ice roads, through truck deliveries over the course of the winter. So that's how I would re-rank our policy issues, and you can kind of step through it. So we've got a few actions and a few options. In the short term, you know, light-duty transport, moving people. We got to talk about things like ethanol, biofuels. But in the long term, it's going to be renewable electricity. You know, that's almost certain. We can do a lot better moving people around in an electric car than we can do by keeping people on internal combustion. We got to move stuff, trucks, and we can do that with biodiesel in the short term, but in the long term, we probably need, excuse me, a green diesel. Something that actually performs the same way that diesel does today, but can reduce our greenhouse gas picture. Yeah.
Why can you not change the green diesel to renewable electricity? In other words, is there no high horsepower output in electric internal engines?
Well, I think there's some very high horsepower electric engines. I mean, the new Tesla Super Roadster, whatever, beat every single category that, what was it, Consumer Reports or one of those, Road and Track or one of the big car testers have ever used. So they blew off the scale. So certainly in terms of generating horsepower or torque, those electric engines will do it. The problem is, I think, for the mass, the volumes of the mass that you're trying to shift, that we just don't have the big electric engines in place, and that the best options, in rail is to use diesel to generate your electricity on site because you need so much electricity rather than try to go to batteries. The real option might not be a green diesel, it might be a fuel cell, right? If Brant was here, I would have written fuel cell, because then I wouldn't want to get in trouble with Brant, who ran the fuel cell center. We got to pump oil, and in the short term, we can probably clean that up a little bit with biodiluent, but in the future, almost certainly, we have to step away from oil production. And the thing is that if every country in the world starts shifting away from oil consumption, which they are, there's not a whole lot of point in pushing oil production here in Canada. We have to keep warm, and in the short term we can do that with lower carbon fuels. Natural gas is a lower carbon fuel, and that's what we're using. But in the future, it's the engineers, you guys, that have to come up with new ways of keeping houses warm and cool. And if natural gas is taken out of the picture, that's the other thing. Lots of people like to talk about natural gas as kind of a destination, but it is not a destination. Ultimately, we'll have to get off natural gas as well as oil. And if we can't use natural gas, what are we going to use? If we can't use that, if that's not available to heat a house, to run a power plant, all those sorts of things, what do we use? It's design, I think. It's conservation. It's other things. And then finally, electricity. Right now, we can do some stuff with distributed renewables, and we're doing that. But in the future, it's not only distributed renewables, it's localized renewables combined with storage. And storage has to become a big part of the puzzle. It's the thing that's missing. So let's talk about why off-grid communities are off-grid. We'll look at the infrastructure. This is Canada, and you can see where our oil pipelines are. There are a few pipelines that are under discussion right now. Keystone XL, the Trans Mountain Northern Gateway. Premier Notley in Alberta has said that she's not going to support Keystone and she's not going to support Northern Gateway, so you can almost just take those off the graph now. Hillary Clinton came out 2 days ago and said that she will not support Keystone. So I think Keystone, unless there's a bit of a miracle and Donald Trump is elected, is dead. So that leaves the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Lots of people not happy about that. It ends in Burnaby. The ships actually come into the Port of Vancouver through the first and second Narrows to pick up oil at the refinery. There's some talk that they would build basically a pipeline down to Delta and create a tanker port beside the ferry port at Tsawwassen. But I don't know if they're going to do that yet. The interesting thing about oil, of course, is that the price of oil over time has shot way up. We've had a couple big spikes in terms of the real value, the real value of oil. And you can see how various world events have impacted the price of oil over time. You don't have time to read them all, but I think the slides get distributed so you can run through them if you feel like it. What's really interesting is that the cause-effect sort of thing that I think economists look for is not all that clear. The one thing I can tell you is that every recession that we've had over the last 35 years, with the exception of one, was preceded by a big run-up in oil prices. And the one that wasn't was preceded by a big run-up in natural gas prices. Almost every recession in recent history, almost living history, has been driven by energy volatility. And so if you're trying to recession-proof your economy, moving away from volatile energy sources like oil towards other things is probably the best thing to do. What's happened most recently is that OPEC has decided that they do not want to continue to be cut out of a global marketplace, and so they have opened the taps. That has pushed the price of oil way down. Goldman Sachs has predicted a $27 a barrel oil sort of point, and has predicted that oil will not come back up for I can't remember what the last year sort of thing they put forward, 15 years, you know, a long period. The thing that's not on here, and I don't know how I would show it exactly, is that they're lifting the sanctions on Iran. And Iran has just as much oil as Saudi Arabia. And when they start pumping oil and putting it into the global mix, it will almost certainly push prices down again. That's bad news for Canada because Canada cannot compete. We're already having a very difficult time competing when oil was up at $100 a barrel. When oil's down at $40, 46 I think today, something like that, it is not really a viable resource. So as a country, we've got a big problem. We had a lot of growing up to do. But I wanted to show you why off-grid communities were off-grid, not really get into a discussion about oil. These are the natural gas pipelines, and you can sort of see there's more of those. There's two proposed in the north, the Mackenzie Valley pipeline, which is actually a pipeline designed to bring natural gas south, not to run it north. Nobody will do that at the current time. The other one is that kind of Alaska pipeline that would connect up to some of the Alaskan fields. Again, I don't see that happening. The one big thing that has been proposed is that we would convert one of the 5 pipes on the Trans-Canada natural gas pipeline to oil. I think it would actually be 2 pipes because, anyway, I'm pretty sure they would do 2 pipes. Yep.
Just a quick question. What's PBL?
That is billion, no, barrels. That's just barrels per day. That's just barrels per day. Yeah. It reads like billion barrels, and I consistently translate it that way, but it just means barrels. I don't know why they do it that way. It's an American thing. We should do liters. That would end up in St. John. There's only one reason that you would run a pipeline to St. John, and that is because the government of New Brunswick is a big booster of this pipeline. But the governments of Ontario and Quebec have a lot of problems with it, and it's going to be really interesting to see if we get it built ever. We have a rail system that looks something like this. You'll notice that we do have 2 lines that run pretty far north. We have the line that runs to Churchill, Manitoba. On the right, we have the line that runs to Hay River, I think it's Hay River, in Northwest Territories. So we actually have a fair bit of connectivity. We have lines that run to 2 ports on the west coast and lines that run into Montreal, of course, and the port of Halifax, port of St. John is connected. So there are a lot of potentials with rail, but rail is really full at this point in Canada. Yep.
Could you please go for a second to the previous slide?
Yep.
Was that red pipeline?
That's the oil.
Correct. It feeds along the way. Is there outlets along the way, or it takes it straight to the port?
Well, that's...
The reason I'm asking is why does it have to go all the way south and come up again in Ontario, whereas you have a much shorter cut straight through?
There are no pipes that go straight across right now, so you'd have to build a new pipe.
The question is, why is it going south and then north again when it's a longer path, unless it's feeding Ontario?
Well, so it was built as a natural gas pipeline designed to feed these populations.
Oh,
okay. Okay? So that's why it follows the route that it follows. They basically hug where the population is. There is a rail line that kind of cuts across there. And that would be the route that you would follow if you were going to build a pipe up there. Because it's hard to build a pipe through the middle of nowhere. This is what we've discovered. Well, it's hard to build a pipe anywhere, but it's very hard to build one in the middle of nowhere. This is our electrical grid. They're mostly provincial grids. They don't really connect all that well. If you actually look at the transfers between provinces, there's a couple places where we transfer a fair bit. You know, from Labrador, we transfer an awful lot into Quebec. That's the result of a bad deal. We transfer a fair bit down into the States. 2 provinces, Saskatchewan and BC, import electricity from the States. Everybody else is basically self-sustaining. But these grids are primarily in the south. They do run north in some cases, so there are opportunities to push the grid into areas that feed communities that otherwise wouldn't be connected. But for the most part, they're clustered around the south. This is our total energy production across the country. You can see why Alberta is so important in the Canadian Federation, because Alberta produces like half of our total energy output. 9 point something exajoules, which is here, 9 point something exajoules. You can see that as you go east, the colors on the charts mostly change. We start to get into much greener options, more hydro, nuclear power in Ontario. We can argue whether that's clean or not. Hydropower in Quebec, hydropower along the west coast, or the east coast, a little bit on the west coast as well. So our total primary energy production is at about 16.8, 17 exajoules. If you recall, our total primary energy supply, what we use, is about 10.5. So that's what we export, about 6 exajoules of energy. A pretty significant amount of that is oil. Half of it is oil. We export a bit of coal, mostly to China, some to the States. A fair bit of natural gas, all to the States. A fair bit of electricity, obviously, all to the States. So what are the lessons? We have a big problem with climate change. We are mostly looking at fossil fuel production and transportation, which has been the big driver for renewable development. The fossil fuel production has been driven by these high oil prices, but this current low price for oil means we have to re-examine that strategy. I think that we can't have just a conventional strategy or a renewable strategy. We have to have both. And that brings me into a bit of a discussion about energy policy. You know, one of the things you have to think about is that energy can really be broken into 3 sectors. You have requirements for home and industrial heat. You have requirements for transportation, personal and corporate transportation. You have requirements for electricity. The provinces control resources and they have control over electricity. The federal government historically has had a lot more influence over transportation, although the feds have stepped largely away from their role in maintaining transport infrastructure. They've downloaded most of the highways to the provinces. There's a few key bridges that they maintain. So the Champlain Bridge in Montreal is a federal responsibility. That's why the feds are rebuilding it, maybe. We have concerns about our greenhouse gases and trade, obviously. So as we try to talk about renewables, which is where I mostly come from, you have to think about how you put together this mix. You know, there's essentially 5 renewable options on the table right now. I think 5 is the best way to describe it. Biomass, which is a renewable as long as you maintain it in a sustainable sort of a fashion. Wind, hydroelectric, geothermal, solar. That's it. Have I missed anything? Any renewables out there that I'm not aware of? I don't think so. 3 sectors: home industrial heat, personal and mass transport, electricity generation. It's very hard to figure out what the appropriate mix is. And one of the big issues is that a lot of these energy sources will do multiple things, right? You can make fuel from biomass. You can use it to heat a house by burning it in a stove or in a furnace. You can make electricity out of it. So what do? You don't have that much biomass, actually. You think we're a country of trees and fields, so we should have a lot of it. If we took all the biomass that's extra in Ontario right now and we burned it all for electricity, we would make up 1.8% of Ontario's electricity demand for the year. That's it. So, you know, we have to be very, very selective with where we throw the biomass, where we throw the wind, where we throw the hydroelectric. Conservation and changing lifestyles. Your generation uses a lot less energy than your parents' generation, largely because you're poorer. This is the truth. I use a lot less power than my parents' generation. My parents always had 2 cars. My parents always had 2 homes. You know, they always had a house and a cottage. I don't have 2 homes, and I don't have 2 cars. And I will never have them, because I cannot afford them. I just won't get into that sort of a space. So I will never use as much power. I will never use as much material as my parents' generation did. You guys will have the same challenges. You'll be living in smaller spaces. You'll be using less power to heat. You will probably be driving differently, probably less. And it's partly because buying a car now and maintaining a car is so expensive, you know. Nobody really wants to take it on. I'd love to take it off. All of these things affect each other, so there's all these interplay going on. You know, the electric car has a big impact on our electrical grid. If the electric car rolls in and suddenly everybody has an electric car, so if you see market penetration faster than we're expecting, we shouldn't be investing at all in things like bioethanol. You know, it should all be invested in renewable electricity. It doesn't make any sense to build infrastructure for something we don't need. And that gets back to what Neil was talking about, the whole resilience issue and the idea of, you know, smart design. What do we need for the future? Yep.
You're saying that, I remember you said that by having electrical cars in the future,
Yeah.
the oil and or natural gas or coal consumption will go down.
Yeah.
But that car needs electricity, and most of electricity resources, at least now and in close future, are being produced by gas, oil, and coal. And I don't think that the efficiency of those power things are better than the cars.
Yeah.
So how does it bring the consumption of these materials down?
Well, so first off, globally you're right. Most electricity will be coal-based or it'll be natural gas-based. There's not a lot of oil going into electricity production. We have an oiler plant down the shore here, a generating facility that was using waste oils, old oil. They've mostly transformed that over to natural gas now, because oil as a substance is just too valuable to put into electricity production. But you're right about natural gas and coal. In Canada, it's not really our big problem, at least in Eastern Canada. Western Canada is a different story. One thing I can say is that the distance that I could move you on 1 ton of coal or 1 ton of biomass with an electric vehicle is about 5 or 6 times as far as I could move you by transforming that into fuel and putting it in an internal combustion engine. So one of the ways you're reducing emissions is by requiring less of the feedstock, you know, to move you much further, or less to move you the same distance. Less.
It's about efficiency of those cars?
It's about efficiency. So there's a big efficiency gain, but you cannot develop a strategy to switch people over to electric vehicles without having a strategy to switch over to renewable sources. And the only way renewable sources would work to fill our entire energy production is with the addition of storage. And we'll come back to that. Yep.
Just a question. Is there a conversation in like policymakers to, like you talked about replacing energy sources to renewables?
Yeah.
Is there any talks to using passive techniques to reduce energy consumption in policy?
Yeah, so almost every energy plan that governments write has a section to keep track of conservation measures. We typically bet that 1% of our demand per year will be, or an additional percent per year will be met through conservation measures. So if I predict what Ontario's energy needs are going to be in, let's say, 25 years, maybe they would grow by 50% with population growth and everything else, but 25% of that, 1% a year, would be met through conservation. So the actual growth would only be 25%. And we're trying to move that 1% a year up towards 2 or 3%, which would be pretty amazing, if we could get that far. We have seen huge increases in energy efficiency in a lot of things. Think about your TVs or your computers or even your phones. They go much further on a charge. They use much less power, although we have a lot more of them. They're much more effective at monitoring and using the power that they have on board. So yeah. In our northern communities, where a lot of the remote or off-grid communities are, biomass is a questionable renewable. Further north you go, the less growth you actually have, the less sustainable it is to cut things down to be able to power things, right? If you get to Iqaluit, there's not exactly a lot of trees that you're going to be harvesting. There's peat. Maybe you could do that. I'm not sure. Wind, I think, is a big one. It's a thumbs up. It works really well. There's a lot of wind up north. There aren't any trees in the way. There are some birds, things like that. Hydro, big thumbs up. I'm not talking about dams on rivers. I'm talking more about tidal power, other ways to harness power and water. Geothermal, maybe not as an energy generator, but as a way to store, geothermal storage. I think it's big, it's coming, it's going to be an important part of any solution. Solar, as you get north, it declines in importance. Great in the summer when you've got 24-hour days. Horrible in the winter when you have 24-hour nights. I think, and there's just my thought, solar is the one technology that is going to advance like iPhones advance. Every year there's going to be a new version of a solar panel. Every year they're going to get more effective and more efficient, and they're going to get cheaper. To the point that I think we're going to have solar on everything in our cities. I think that we're going to have solar on our streets. I think that we're going to have solar on our bags. I think we're going to have solar on the roof of our cars. I think that it's going to be cheap enough to put it almost anywhere. And I think what that's going to drive is this kind of revolution in personalized power generation, where you generate your own power, you store it in your own batteries, you use it on your own time. And that's going to really call into question the whole idea of a grid and what is on-grid and off-grid. That's just a thought. I don't know why that's doing that again. Okay, so I'm getting towards the end here. Policy can shape our energy supply. And there are some international examples out there, but I don't have time to get into them. I think policy can be dwarfed and swamped by technologies. What we're seeing right now with Uber, and the whole revolution that's happening in the cab business could happen again in 5 or 10 years with self-driving vehicles. Imagine a city that doesn't require any on-street parking because vehicles don't really park. They just drop you off and pick you up as required. You free up a huge amount of space inside those cities. You free up massive amounts of space in the suburbs where you have driveways and garages that may not be necessary anymore. So it'll be very, very fast. People, when you say things like this, people sort of laugh. But if I talked about Uber 5 years ago, that all of a sudden everybody's going to be able to pick up their phone and press a button and have somebody come pick them up, and it's not going to be a cab company, and we're going to be bypassing all these things, nobody would have believed that would happen either. And renewable tech is moving way, way faster than all the conventional technologies. Way faster. If you want to build a nuclear plant today and you go talk to S&C Lavalin's nuclear division, they will sell you a nuclear plant, and it will be virtually the same with better computers as the plants that we were building in 1971. We haven't really come up with a new generation of nuclear. We tried to, but we didn't get there. If you buy a solar panel today, it's going to be much, much better than the solar panel they would have sold you 5 years ago. Just like if you buy a new iPhone today because they're going on sale, it'll probably be about the same as the one you have now. So Canadian energy strategies, I'm right at the end of my time, I think, so I'm just going to zip through all these things. Usually I have a lot of chatting. These are all of our energy sources. The dotted circles, the dotted lines are potentials. We haven't built them, they're there. And you'll notice that there's certain clusters, and those clusters can help us define how our strategy should evolve. And what it kind of breaks down to is that in the east, we've got all kinds of renewable. In the world of climate change, Eastern Canada is going to be a happy place because we're getting warmer temperatures, we're getting more rain, we have lots of nutrients. Plants grow faster now than they used to. Our farms and our forests are more lush and growing faster than anybody observed, in the past. And that's probably going to accelerate. Eastern Canada equals happy under climate change. Western Canada, not so much. Western Canada gets drier. Western Canada will have more fire as the forests dry out. We'll likely lose a big chunk of the rainforest on the west coast. That's already starting to happen. You'll have seen articles, if you're watching for that sort of thing, about how the sequoias down in California are now feeling stress. It takes them about a decade and a half to feel stress. They're the largest living thing on the planet, and yet now they're starting to see that. It'll take a decade and a half for them to be unstressed of back to rainy temperatures and proper temperatures, and that's unlikely to happen under this current sort of a regime. So we're going to see big changes in the West, but that Western policy is still dominated by fossil fuels. And in the West, they're going to have to figure out how to balance renewables and fossil production in what I think is going to be a failing fossil economy. And so the West is going to have some serious challenges. And then we have the North. And the North is all of those off-grid type communities, all those places, 3 energy regions. Yep.
Are those circles in scale?
Roughly.
The amount of energy that they can produce?
Roughly. As good as I could do at the time, all the dotted ones are guesses.
Because I remember that I read somewhere that by 2020, Canada is trying to produce 20% of its electricity by green energy.
Yeah.
So it means that a small dot, some in Ontario, is equal to all the wind potential in Canada.
Yeah. Yeah.
The count hydro is green, right?
Hydro is green. Hydroelectric power is green.
But the potential is considering these circles, nobody should think about wind energy because just focusing on hydro is enough for whole Canada.
In the south, yes. In the north, you could do wind, but you've got to have a way to store that power. Whether that's going to be batteries, whether it's going to be pump storage, reservoirs of some kind, whether it's going to be Hydrostore, which is this company that puts great big balloons underwater, uses wind power to fill up the balloons when there's excess, uses the force of the water to squeeze out the air and run whatever they run, generators, to get the power out at the end. There are these technologies or options out there. So you've got an energy region in the east that's dominated by renewables. You've got an energy region in the west that's dominated by fossil. And then in the north, you've got your off-grid type communities, which again, show up like this. So that northern strategy basically covers them all. There's a few that are not inside my little bubble, but you could stretch it out. So just finishing up, one of the things about these northern communities, they don't have a huge amount of resources. They don't have a lot of capacity to be able to develop unique solutions. And so what you actually need is a policy that identifies a common technological solution. We have one right now. It's called diesel gensets. And the nice thing about a diesel genset is that they work the same everywhere, right? You plunk it down, you turn it on, it makes a lot of noise. You truck in or you barge in or you fly in diesel fuel in big drums, and then you have a tech who maintains the genset, you know, watches it, makes sure that it keeps getting lubricated and it's full of oil and all the rest. We need a common tech solution that is like that, whether it is wind and hydro, whether it is wind and some kind of storage, whether it's a combination of, you know, other types of technologies, whether you bring solar in. I think it's got to be a common piece. And that, I think, is missing from a lot of the dialogue right now. Most people, when they talk about a community, they say, okay, well, this community has these resources. You know, it's a unique mix of resources, so I'm going to come up with a unique solution. The problem is we have 292 of these places, and unless we're willing to invest in 292 unique solutions, as a strategy, a policy strategy, it doesn't work. We need one. So it might be this mix of generation and storage, but ideally, you know, one piece of each. The nice thing is that they're small, right? A relatively small plant, you know, 2 or 3 wind turbines generating 5 or 6 megawatts on a windy day with good storage might be enough to cover a community's needs. And so you're not talking about a huge amount of money when it comes down to that, as long as you can roll that solution out again and again, train people to look after it so that you have interchangeable personnel, and basically roll it out across these different places. There's some unique challenges. As you get further north, there's ice and, you know, wind conditions that might not be perfect. There are issues with, you know, how you could do storage and whether geothermal would work or not. But that's, I think, the piece, the puzzle that we need to solve. So I don't think we need to read all that, because that just basically says what I have said. Yeah, and I think, again, the most important thing I want to leave you with is this idea that there's this really rapidly changing technological base out there. You know, that things are moving very fast on the renewable front. And so coming up with a strategy to move forward on renewables means being a bit of a futurist and thinking about, well, what is it that people are going to need? The one thing that seems clear is that electricity is the lingua franca. You know, it's the common currency of the future for energy. We'll be able to heat houses more effectively with it. We'll be able to move people. We'll be able to power all the devices and things that we need. So developing an electricity strategy seems to be the one that makes the most sense. And that's where I finish. And we can take questions and have discussion. Yep.
I remember that you mentioned 90% emission-free for Canada. That's going to come from nuclear, wind, clean coal, and
yeah.
stuff like that. Can you give us a breakdown of that 90%? Because it's a very curious number. 90%.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of provinces in Canada where 100% of the electricity is clean now. Clean by the Conservative Party's definition. Ontario is clean because we don't have coal in the mix anymore. We have renewables, including a lot of hydro. We have a lot of nuclear, which they think of as non-emitting, non-polluting. We have some natural gas, mostly as backup, but natural gas is considered clean in the mix because every megawatt of power associated with natural gas is about 30% the emissions of the same megawatt from coal. So you're cleaner. Not perfectly clean, but cleaner. So to meet that goal, every province would basically have to be like Ontario. The provinces that have a problem are BC has a coal-fired plant that they have to deal with, and they import coal-fired electricity from south of the border, which is a problem. Saskatchewan has coal-fired plants. Alberta has coal-fired plants. Those provinces would have to do something to the plants. So in Saskatchewan, the Boundary Dam plant is now connected to the carbon capture and storage system, which would theoretically push them into that clean coal regime that the Harper government talked about. Whether or not they can continue to pay for that is another question, because carbon capture and storage seems to work, but it seems to work at a very high price. I'm betting that Premier Notley is going to start dismantling the coal-fired power generation in her tenure. If I was on her panel, that's what I would be recommending, because they could easily switch over to natural gas. And they could easily expand their renewable fleet. And that alone would drop their emissions pretty significantly. And for Canada, that's about it. To get that 90%, that's really what has to be done.
One of the topics that you have not addressed is the question, well, in fact, there are two parts to this, is fracking and the impact of trans-border or cross-border influences on that energy spectrum.
Yeah, so fracking, I never talked about it, and it is a big issue. Hydraulic fracturing of shale in order to release natural gas and in some cases oil. The big concern with it is that it requires the injection of water with lots of chemicals mixed in under high pressure. The chemical mix is proprietary usually, so we don't know exactly what they're pumping in. You're pumping down below aquifers, so you're going past an aquifer in order to get to where the shale is and where the, this gas product is. Lots of anecdotal evidence, documentaries of people lighting their taps on fire because there's been some transfer of methane and other gases into the aquifers. Not a lot of really good data on how much that's happening, whether it's one well or 100 wells or 1,000 wells. Also, lots of good evidence that those wells don't last that long. They've tracked the recovery of natural gas and the recovery of oil from the wells over time. Canada has fracking in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. I don't know about Manitoba. I know our Manitoba fellow just stepped outside. Ontario has a soft moratorium, meaning that Dalton McGuinty, as the premier, said we're just not going to do it until the science is good. There's not a legislative piece behind that, so it's not banned. It's just they're not permitting any. Quebec, same sort of thing. They said they'll talk about it. They'll try to explore it a bit. New Brunswick has been pushing it, because New Brunswick is probably the most vulnerable province in the Federation right now in terms of their economy and their population and everything else. They've probably got the weakest economy of all, and they're looking for anything that will jumpstart things. But there's been huge pushback from First Nations and from rural communities on this. So they haven't gone more than a few test wells. Same in Newfoundland. Few test wells near Corner Brook, which is where the shale deposits are along that spine. Alberta and BC, nobody has really pushed back. I think it's because there's an energy culture in the places that they're doing it. These are energy towns, and they're not afraid of oil wells, and they're not afraid of other wells. They're used to it. They've had them for years and years. There is starting to be a big pushback in the Dakotas, which is where they're doing a lot of it south of the border, because the air quality has gotten so bad. It has nothing to do with the water quality, it's the air. The emissions from the fugitive side of things. There's an awful lot of natural gas and particulates and things like that getting into the air. Air quality's dropped, kids can't play outside. A lot of people are noticing. And that's a big issue. How it's going to develop, I don't know.
But I think as you speak to that, the critical piece here is, as you say, that the unburnt fugitive gases and the radiative forcing that comes with that.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that I don't like about fracking is that until fracking really started taking off, natural gas in terms of discoveries was in decline. So we weren't finding any new big natural gas reservoirs the price of natural gas was starting to push up. And from an environmental policy perspective, that's a good thing. Because what it meant is that people were starting to get smarter about how they used it. And they were far less likely to develop new gas-fired plants and things like that. They were far more likely to look into new conservation and things like that. In the early 2000s, they were talking about natural gas getting up to $15 or $20 a gigajoule. And right now it's at $3 or $4 a gigajoule. If it had gone up to that extent, it would have forced a lot of people to step away. As it is, now people are talking about using natural gas in trucks, compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas in trucks. Everybody is talking about building new gas-fired power plants. Ontario's done it. Alberta's talking about it. The big problem is I think those are going to be stranded assets. I don't think natural gas is the destination. I think it's a bridge. Like it's a cleaner fuel, but it's not clean. And the production methods are getting increasingly dirty. And so for us to say, well, we got to get off oil, so we're going to embrace natural gas, means that we're going to embrace something that is causing all sorts of other problems, and yet doesn't actually get us to our desired destination, which is a zero carbon, zero emission sort of a future. I'm probably done, aren't I?
Yeah, I think that we should, yeah, thanks so much.
No worries.